introduce Melissa Edwards, and you want to introduce your background and cool, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here this evening talking to a group of people in a community of a number of people who I saw putting their hands up of having been here tonight for the first time, and I include myself in the group of people who raised their hands. So it's also my first time in this community. And what I'm here to do is to share some stories with you about the kind of work that I've been doing in the UTS Business School in terms of both teaching and research, and also across the university working in this sort of transdisciplinary space, and some of the experiments that we've been running with our undergraduate cohort in a program called the BCII program. And so am I a designer? I'm not sure. Am I a business academic? I'm not sure. My PhD was in the area of complexity and looking at complexity in the way that people organise through a complex systems approach. And so I guess I describe myself as somebody who sits in this space trying to really understand how do we enable emergence, or what are the conditions that enable emergence. And one of the lenses, I guess, that I've been using to enable that conversation is a design lens. And so in the business school, I've been teaching in a space in the postgraduate programs, looking at a course called Innovation by Design. And it's really about using a design lens to enable people to understand how to create change, or how to set the conditions for change within their workplace contexts. And tonight's topic is about systems change, and most of those people are working as individuals within organisations, and those organisations are within industries which sit in economies. So how do we create systems change when we're individuals working in that huge system within which we operate? And I think this framework by Nelson is a really good one. And so for me, the process of design really starts with change and about creating difference, and what is the change and the difference that we want to create, or that we want to see. What's the intentionality behind that? So that's one of the first principles, I think, of the design lens that sits behind the way of thinking. And the other one is complexity, and we've heard that in both the presentations so far, so I probably won't reiterate anything that's been said, except to say that it's really important as a lens for us to think about complex adaptive systems rather than systems thinking per se, in order for us to get our heads around the potential for emergence to be able to occur. So we also use this lens of saying that actually systems are patterns of interactions of humans in this context within which they work and operate, and those are socio and ecological systems. So we need to bring the ecological system, and the next layer of that is what's called Earth system science, which takes us into a whole nother layer of interactions between various different spheres of activity, of which human spheres of activity are only one of a number of others. So we need to kind of think through this, and that everything that we do in our interactions is both with the social, with the other people who are like us, but also those other systems within which we have our existence. And that there's a dynamicism to that, and there's a dynamicism of which we have an effect, and that also has an effect back on us, and that's something we often don't pay a lot of attention to. And again, we've had this idea that the total system is more than the sum of its parts as well, which is, so how does what I do actually have impact on that overall system? And it's to then take a step back from our own agency and to understand that there's some form of collective agency that works in that space in between. So again, just to get a little bit out of the conceptual here, I'd put it in the context of the fact that this is the 30th anniversary of the Brundtland Commission. And from the Brundtland Commission came the Sustainable Development Goals. So, how many people have heard of the word sustainability? How many people use it in their work? We think and we talk about this a lot. 30 years on, okay, so that's a long conversation. So I'd like to provoke almost a little bit here this evening and say that we know what the concepts of sustainability are about very well. And we've had quite a bit of progress in the sustainable development domain, particularly in the social sphere in terms of human development. However, the environmental dimension continues to get increasingly outside of our control, and some people are now talking about this concept of the Anthropocene, whereby our impact on the environment as humans is actually outside of our own capacity now to be able to influence. It's coming back on to us. So it's a contested area, space, but it puts us again into a different way of thinking about our capacity to be able to design systems. And I think it's a space that we need to sit in. Another space I think also I'd like to just again conceptually frame here is the notion of resilience. We talk about resilience a lot. And I think, Claire, I really resonated with the concept that you were talking about in this notion of regenerative. So if we are really to have agency in terms of creating change and difference, are we creating change in terms of keeping the status quo within the system as it currently exists and allowing some aspects of that system to, as I think Carrie, you nicely said, we mourn the loss of those and we let those go? Or are we thinking about a really regenerative approach which may actually take us into a form of resilience whereby we're recreating a new way of interconnecting with one another, of relating to one another and the biosphere within which we are operating? So, you know, there are three different ways of actually thinking about resilience, and we tend to just stick with one, and that is about our own resilience. So again, just a bit of provocative thinking here in terms of what can we actually change. So that's what I do a lot in my work, and I go out and I talk to people, and what we've been trying to do in the space of business models is try to understand what is it that people are doing where they really are trying to create something new. They're using the ideas that we have and that we understand about what it means to create sustainable value. And again, I love this image, and I've used it before in another presentations, but it is a really nice little story where the innovator in this space was trying to create a way of us being able to recirculate our goods and services, because we have increasing consumption, but we have the same amount of materials within which we consume. So how are we going to do that? Well, you know, let's collaborate, let's share, let's circulate. It's a great technology. We know the sharing economy exists. We have these amazing platforms that enable us to do that, and we all want to feel good about doing this thing, right? No, massive blocking point. What was the blocking point? The blocking point was sitting right here. It's easier for us to throw. So it's the kind of inbuilt behaviours that we have inside of our own ways of being that we actually really need to challenge if we want to really start to think about how would we enable these models, which we know exist already, to actually thrive. And that comes down to the social dimension. So again, for me, it's this kind of how do we create better conversations about the kind of dimensions between our social interactions, our behaviours as human beings, and this kind of invisible sort of biosphere, or the materials that we're using in order to enable our existence. When something as simple as this, which we think is a kind of advancement, makes it easier for us to throw stuff away than it does to actually share it and recirculate it within the systems within which we live. It's a kind of paradox in a way. So when we then sort of went around and we started interviewing more people who were working in this idea of a circular economy. And the circular economy really is trying to work into that space. How can we still create systems of production and consumption that allow us to thrive as human beings in the way that we have in this model of a sustainable society, but also do that within the limits of the material world within which we live and we exist? And there's a real tension in here that we started to uncover when we were actually talking to people in this space, and it comes down to the system within which we operate. And again, I found it really interesting that that came up as one of the words constantly used by people in the interviews. So when we kind of take a step back from that, you know, the competition for these people is not actually the standard competition which you think, which is the people already existing in the industry. It's the status quo with people and how they consume. It's their expectations about what they consume and how they expect to be able to have that come to them. It's the status quo of us as a society. How do you challenge the status quo in a kind of competitive market that reinforces that status quo? Is a massive challenge. It's a paradox. We found that the people in these organisations weren't necessarily sticking to one way of achieving that. It wasn't like, okay, we need to create a profitable business model. Sometimes we need to prioritise the social aims of the organisation, operate more as a social enterprise. Perhaps we need to also operate and get some source of funding for government, or we need to leverage and put tension onto the policy space. So we're maybe acting almost as advocates in some areas of our business activity. We're also thriving and trying to survive as a business because we're competing against these existing businesses that we're trying to kind of insurge into in a way. So they're creatively trying to think through this space of not only just focusing on a business case, but also being social change agents and also advocates in a policy space. So it's a kind of hybrid model. And in that sense, these people are innovators and they're advocates for a new way of actually doing and conducting business. And we're coming up with this idea of actually taking a proactive role. So business can do that, people in industry can do that, and they have the capacity to do so. They've got to go out there and start to shake up or activate consumers, shake up and activate policymakers, shake up and activate other business people in their own industry to do things differently. And that comes through then this kind of idea of creating a collective imagination of a way of doing things differently through networks and different ways of collaborating. And we did a little bit of an experiment with this, which was kind of fun. We brought into a whole bunch of people in from one industry and actually tried to ask them to reimagine what their industry would look like if they were to seriously take into account the kind of environmental limitations of the current way of operating. And it led to some really interesting conversations where people who would be traditionally competing with one another were like, oh, hang on a minute, why are we doing that? We should be collaborating if we really only have a limited resource. How could we do that differently? How could we do that more effectively, more efficiently? So, we need to create more of these spaces where people can have those types of conversations. We've started to then think, we really need to, in business schools, talk about a sustainable business model that's beyond CSR. It's not just about reporting what we already do well, it's really about reconceptualising what it is that business does. And I won't go into all of these dimensions now, but that's one of the really interesting things that came out of that is that purpose is really important. It's this intentionality. It's the change you want to see and making that the forefront of all the things that you're doing. As a result of that, there's another study that I've just been recently involved in, which relates to the BCorp model. How many people know of the BCorp model, or maybe you're in a BCorp? And this is a really great example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. So what we were doing here is saying, how can we understand the sort of purpose-led model of the BCorp in order to enable that model to scale up? And perhaps try to challenge the status quo. So background on a BCorp, lots of people know what it is. If you don't, I'm not going to go into it now due to my time restrictions. But basically we were talking to people who were operating BCorps and again trying to understand what enabled them and what they found as challenging, not for them operating their own business, but in relation to their stakeholders, so their suppliers or their customers, perhaps in terms of getting some form of financing. How do you actually articulate the difference between what you're doing in a full-purpose business model and therefore try to influence those who are, in part of the system in which you are operating, your small little system? So all of them spoke forefront about purpose as being the most important thing. And always discussing purpose, not necessarily forcing it onto others, but really clearly articulating that every time and every interaction that they have. And the types of relationships that they were forming, predominantly, there were two different categories. They either talked about intentionally going out and trying to seek a relationship with a particular type of supplier or customer for a purpose, or the organic form where it just sort of happened. And it was very intentional. So the intentional theme was very heavily loaded. And that was, for example, where a company, I can give you an example of one of the Latin American companies who were providing packaged goods. They wanted to really get serious about using a plastic that was biodegradable. They couldn't find the adequate supplier, and so they went out and campaigned the supplier to start to search and procure a plastic that they could use in their packaging that would be biodegradable. So you've got a small player pushing back against a large supplier, demanding and asking them to create the change. So that's that kind of really intentional forming a relationship, and that's the kind of thing that enables emergence within a system. It's not, we have to change the rules of the system, everybody. It's this enabling people to have these conversations where they understand that they're intentionally and purposefully creating that system. And so then one of the other things that was very interesting is when they were talking about the types of relationships that they had, the kind of normal way that people, kind of business way would talk about their relationships is what we categorise as being transactional. It's, what was the cost? Could I get it more efficiently? Was it a quality product? Mostly these conversations that people were having did not relate to that category. They were talking about it as being a symbolic way of building their purpose. They were talking about it in an advocacy way. That's where we have to form these relationships in order to form some kind of change. Or that it was part of a purpose of building a bigger change, so being part of something bigger than themselves in a sort of network or movement. And this is the point where I want to leave off because I realise I'm running out of time here. It wasn't a unitary movement, and that's really important. We often think that we have to wait for someone to come up with a grand idea and we're all going to come on board with that and everything will change. These people in the BCorp movement are actively organising behind the Be the Change. It's a purposeful movement. But when you actually look at what each of those different corps are doing, all those people, individuals are doing, it's very, very diverse and for different reasons. Some of them want to create systems change. Some people just want to create less plastic. So they don't have a united slogan. And I think that's, again, another really important element of creating and enabling systems change. You need something that acts as an attractor that is broad enough and generic enough to attract a bunch of different people who are actually really quite diverse and working in various different aspects of the system. So they can act in loosely coordinated ways in order to enable that change to emerge. It's not necessarily an ideology as such that's coming from the kind of top down. So on that point, I think that I'll finish, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here tonight, and thank you very much for the other speakers. I really enjoyed the fact that I think we've all picked up on this complexity lens and looking at change as being something that happens and rises up.